I rise today as Syria is about to enter its 8th year of conflict. We've witnessed 7 years of displacement and violence, 7 years of war crimes, 7 years of Bashar al-Assad's illegitimate grasp on power. To say that it is past time for Assad to go, or that it is past time for the conflict to be resolved, dramatically underestimates the suffering, the horrible suffering and destruction the people of Syria have experienced. In these 7 years, almost 500,000 Syrians have been killed and more than 12 million have been displaced from their homes. This conflict has disproportionately affected children, as all conflicts do. According to Save the Children, inside Syria, 7.5 million children have lived their whole lives knowing nothing but war. Emotional and psychological stress has manifested itself physically. Syrian children now face an increase in heart disease, diabetes, and depression. These children are growing up in refugee camps with no end in sight. This means the loss of their childhood and of educational opportunities. And I don't exaggerate when I say that because of this war, an entire generation of Syrians will be both displaced and disaffected in an already volatile region. Ignoring these children ensures decades of instability to come. In eastern Ghouta, this past week, we saw the most recent example of the brutality of the Assad regime, aided and abetted by Russia and Iran. While only just now making the headlines, eastern Ghouta has been held under siege by the Syrian government since 2013. This neighborhood, which had supposedly been designated as a de-escalation zone, has been bombarded by Syrian government forces armed with Russian weapons. In just a few days, 500 civilians have been killed, and that number is growing. Years after the international community reached a consensus that Assad had lost his legitimacy as the leader of Syria, he not only remains in power, but is more secure than ever. The United States has not only failed to exert moral leadership in the face of Syrian suffering, but has failed to show strategic leadership in the face of a tangible threat to U.S. National security. I have long called on both the Obama and Trump administrations, warning that U.S. interests were not being represented in Syrian negotiations. But this has never been more clearly illustrated than in November of this past year, November of 17, when a picture circulated of Presidents Rouhani, Putin, and Erdogan shaking hands in Russia after a round of negotiations to determine a potential resolution of the Syrian conflict. I have to ask, is it now U.S. policy to let these three dictate policy in the Middle East? Rouhani, Putin, and Erdogan? The U.S. was not there, nor were our European allies. The U.S. is failing our own interests by ceding leadership in Syria to Iran and Russia, whose national security interests often directly contradict our own. And what do these bullying regimes want from Syria? Let's start with Iran. Iran sees Syria as an investment in its political infrastructure and its campaign for regional hegemony. It is their, quote, land bridge, unquote, from Tehran to Beirut, a weapons pipeline, a training camp for Hezbollah. It is a practice ground for a future war with Israel. What about the Russians? The Russian government, led by Mr. Putin, has made clear that they believe all Syrian territory must return to the Assad regime and to the Assad regime's control before political reforms can be considered. Putin seeks a solution that shows that he is the arbiter of events in the Middle East. Lately, foreign leaders, including Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel, President Rouhani, and King Salman of Saudi Arabia, fly to Moscow instead of Washington. They see a Russia that seeks to write the rules of international order and an America that sits back, too enmeshed in our own domestic political strife to lead. But this is not the America I know and that most Americans know. The America I know does not believe that where you are born should dictate where you live or die, or if you spend your childhood in a refugee camp. The America I know does not stand by while enemy nations threaten to expand their spheres of influence. The America I know sees the complexity of our own foreign involvements, understanding, for instance, that ISIS cannot be fully defeated without considering the context of the Syrian civil war. And the America I know supports its allies like Israel that share a chaotic border with a nation at war with itself. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy spoke at the Fort Worth, Texas Chamber of Commerce on the challenges posed by the Soviet regime. He said, and I quote, "This country which desires only to be free, which desires only to be secure, which desired to live in peace for 18 years under 3 administrations, has borne more than its share of the burden, has stood watch for more than its number of years. I don't think we're fatigued or tired. We would like to live as we once lived, but history will not permit it. The balance of power is still on the side of freedom. We are still the keystone in the arch of freedom, and I think we will continue to do as we have done in our past. Our duty," unquote. So said President Kennedy. He spoke to the paradox of our country then and now, what we continue to face. If we are to remain the keystone in the arch of freedom, we cannot become fatigued by the responsibility to fight tyranny. These are the very issues that should receive public debate as part of a congressional consideration of a new authorization for the use of military force, known by that acronym AUMF. We undermine our own credibility when we continue to send our men and women into conflicts that Congress has not authorized. Secretary Tillerson, our Secretary of State, has indicated that he sees a need for a long-term U.S. military presence in Syria. Yet many of us believe that there is no purely military solution to this conflict. Where is the strategy, we ask? I'd like to see the administration put forward a plan that encompasses all components of this conflict: military, political, and humanitarian. When we ask our men and women in uniform to put their lives on the line to protect our homeland and fight terrorism, we need to be willing to back them up by doing our jobs here in Washington. Just consider Pennsylvania. Pennsylvanians have made a substantial sacrifice in the past 17 years of war. 288 of our brave service members have been killed in action in those 17 years, and almost 2,000 wounded in action in Afghanistan and Iraq. We owe it to these men and women to have a robust bipartisan debate about this strategy and a vote on an AUMF. We should also vote on legislation to cut off financing for ISIS or any other terrorist organization in the world. I have a bipartisan bill to Stop Terrorist Operational Resources and Money Act, the so-called STORM Act, with Senator Isaacson. I have a bill as well with Senator Rubio, the Preventing Destabilization of Iraq and Syria Act, to promote humanitarian aid and sanction the Russian and Iranian actors who are destabilizing this region. All of the components of a comprehensive strategy. So let's have a serious debate on this critical national security issue. We're not always faced with situations in which our moral obligation and our strategic priorities lead to the same conclusion. This is one of those rare moments. So may it be said of us, Mr. President, years from now, just as President Kennedy said, that we do our duty to continue to be the keystone in the arch of freedom, including helping the Syrian people, especially her children, be free of Assad's brutality and bombing.